She had no idea I'd spent the last 4 months learning to use a hearing aid I didn't actually need. Let me back up. My name is Elliot. No, wait. I need to start this the right way. The way my late wife Connie always told me to start anything important. Don't begin with yourself, she'd say. Begin with the moment everything changed. The moment everything changed was a Tuesday in October when my daughter-in-law Brielle walked into my kitchen without knocking. She never knocked anymore, and started talking to my son about me, like I wasn't standing right there at the stove making oatmeal. He can't hear half of what we're saying anyway, she said. Low voice, casual, the way you'd say the dog needs a bath. My son, Kendall, my boy 34 years old, who I coached through Little League and drove to every single one of his college visits. He didn't correct her. He just nodded, picked up his coffee mug, nodded. I kept stirring. I didn't let on that I had heard every single word, and in that moment, standing at my own stove in my own kitchen in my own house, I made a decision. Let them think it. I should tell you about the hearing aid first, because that's where this whole thing starts to make sense. I'd been having some mild hearing loss in my left ear for about 2 years. My doctor confirmed it, nothing serious, the kind of thing a lot of men my age deal with. She recommended a hearing aid. I got fitted. I wore it maybe 3 days before I realized the device was actually too effective. It amplified everything, and at 68 years old, I'd gotten used to a certain amount of natural quiet, so I stopped wearing it regularly. But I kept it, and I kept the box. And after that Tuesday morning in October, I started bringing it out every time Brielle and Kendall came over, making a point of turning it slightly, not off, just to a lower setting. I'd lean forward with this look on my face. I'd ask people to repeat things. Kendall would glance at Brielle, and Brielle would mouth something to him, and I would sit there and hear every word of it. I don't feel guilty about that, not even a little. Connie passed 3 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. She was 64. We had 41 years together, and I know people say things like that all the time, but I mean it the way it's supposed to be meant. She was the whole thing. The marriage, the family, the house, the reason I got up in the mornings. When she died, I did what men of my generation do. I kept moving. I fixed things around the house. I called Kendall every Sunday. I started taking walks. What I didn't do was make my grief visible or needy, because I didn't want to be a burden. That's a mistake I want other people my age to hear clearly. Do not confuse dignity with invisibility, because while I was quietly getting on with things, other people were quietly making plans. The house was the first thing. It's a 4-bedroom Craftsman in Claremont, California. Nothing spectacular. But Connie and I bought it in 1989 for $187,000, and it's worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.4 million now. We paid it off 17 years ago. Property values in the Inland Empire went a direction nobody predicted, and here we were, sitting on something significant without ever intending to. About 8 months after Connie died, Kendall started bringing up the house in conversation. Nothing direct at first, just observations. Lot of square footage for one person, Dad. That backyard must be a lot to maintain. Have you thought about what your plan is long term? I told him I didn't have a plan. The house was home. I wasn't going anywhere. He nodded like he accepted that. He didn't accept that. Brielle came into the picture when Kendall was 26. She was smart, put together, worked in commercial real estate, and that last detail is one I wish I'd paid more attention to earlier. She knew property values. She knew what a Craftsman in Claremont was worth. She knew things I didn't realize she was always calculating. In the beginning, she was perfectly pleasant. I liked her fine. Connie had some reservations she never quite articulated to me, and I remember asking her once what her hesitation was, and she said, "I don't know yet, Lou, something." She looks at things like she's appraising them. I told her that was probably just her professional habit. Connie gave me the look she reserved for when she thought I was being naive. She was right. She was often right. I miss that about her, too. After the wedding, Brielle started spending more time at the house. That was normal. Then she started making suggestions about the house. The kitchen could be opened up. The back lot could be subdivided. Had we thought about downsizing, since the kids could use the capital for something more productive than a house that was just sitting there? I answered all of it pleasantly. I changed no subject lines. But after Connie died, and the suggestions got more frequent, and the knocking stopped, and the Tuesday morning happened, that was when I started paying attention in a different way. The hearing aid situation went on for about 6 weeks before I understood what I was actually dealing with. It wasn't just Brielle wanting the house. It was Brielle and Kendall wanting the house on a timeline. I pieced it together from fragments. Conversations they had in my kitchen, in my living room, in my driveway, always in the comfortable belief that Dad couldn't quite catch it all. They were looking at a property in Pasadena. A flip project, something Brielle did on the side. They needed a significant down payment, around $280,000, and they didn't have it liquid. What they had was a father with a paid-off house. Their plan, as best I could reconstruct it from what I heard and what I later confirmed, convinced me to add Kendall to the deed. Just a formality, Dad, just so if anything happens to you there's no probate mess. Then, once he was on title, push for a refinance or an equity line I'd be co-signing for, and the money would flow in their direction while I stayed in the house, presumably unaware of what had been done. It was not a stupid plan, I'll give them that. It relied entirely on my trust, my age, my grief, and my ears. 3 for 3, they thought. 0 for 4, it turned out. I want to say something here, because I know some of you are thinking it. How could I stay quiet? How could I keep going to Sunday dinners and barbecues and let Kendall hug me at the door knowing what I knew? Because I needed more than suspicion. I needed documentation. And because part of me, the part that raised that boy, that watched him take his first steps on the linoleum in the kitchen, that Brielle wanted to tear out, that part of me needed to be absolutely certain before I did anything that couldn't be undone. I called my attorney, a woman named Ms. Adler, who I'd used for estate matters years back. I didn't tell her everything. I told her I wanted to review my estate documents and make sure everything was current and that my property was protected. She updated my will, confirmed I had a trust in place, and added a specific provision that any transfer of the property title required my signature before 2 witnesses and a notary, not just mine alone. Then I called a friend from my old firm. I worked in civil engineering for 32 years, a man named Roy. Not Roy from the list. Roy's a different Roy. Roy had retired a few years back and had gotten very into what he called the digital stuff. Security cameras, smart home systems, the whole ecosystem. He helped me put cameras at the front door, the back door, and one in the living room connected to my phone. Nothing illegal about it in California as long as it's your own property and properly disclosed. I put a small notice on the door, the kind most people don't read, and then I waited. The first real move came on a Thursday in November. Kendall called to say he and Brielle wanted to stop by to help me with some paperwork. Would I be around Friday afternoon? I said sure. I told him I had a doctor's appointment in the morning, but I'd be home by 2. I was home by noon. I was sitting in the kitchen with the hearing aid turned to its full setting when they let themselves in with the key I'd given them 2 years ago for emergencies. They didn't come back to the kitchen right away. There was about 4 minutes. I watched on my phone, where they went to my home office and looked at the desk. I don't know exactly what they were looking for, but I know what I'd left there intentionally. My copy of the old deed to the house, some outdated financial statements, and a handwritten note to myself that said, "Call Ms. Adler Ree." Title question, is adding K still advisable? I'd left that note on purpose. I wanted them to think I was considering it. When they came into the kitchen, Brielle was carrying a manila folder. "Hey, Dad," Kendall said. He smiled. He looked tired. I remember noticing that and feeling a pull in my chest because he's my son, and even then, even knowing what I knew, I loved him. "Hey, buddy," I said. "Coffee." We sat down. Brielle opened the folder. There were documents inside, a grant deed form, some typed explanatory pages. She started explaining that they'd spoken to someone, a real estate consultant, who had recommended the cleanest way to protect the house long-term was to add Kendall to the title now, while everything was straightforward. "Just makes things easier," she said. "For everyone." I leaned forward a little, touched the hearing aid. "Sorry, say that again?" She said it again, slower. I looked at the documents. I looked at my son. He was watching the table. "Can I hold on to these a few days?" I said. "I want to read through everything before I sign anything." Brielle's expression, it moved through something I recognized. Recalibration. She'd expected this to be one visit. She hadn't planned for delay. "Of course," she said. "Take your time." They left about 40 minutes later. I waited until their car turned off the block, and then I picked up the phone and called Miss Adler. What Miss Adler told me took about 20 minutes and left me very calm in the way that only happens when something you suspected turns out to be exactly as bad as you thought. The grant deed Brielle had brought was real, professionally prepared, not something they'd typed up themselves. It would have added Kendall as a co-owner with right of survivorship, meaning if I died, the house passed entirely to him with no probate, no contest, no questions. That part was legitimate enough that I might have signed it on sentiment alone if I hadn't known what I knew. But Miss Adler had already researched something else for me. Brielle's LLC, she had a real estate investment LLC in her name, had filed for a construction loan from a private lender 6 weeks earlier, using a property in Claremont as anticipated collateral. The property didn't exist yet in their portfolio. It was the house. My house. They'd already used it as leverage with a lender before Kendall was even on the title. That's fraud. That's not sort of fraud, or fraud adjacent, or a misunderstanding. That is using someone else's property as collateral without their knowledge or consent. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after I hung up. The house was quiet. Connie's roses were still in the side yard. I'd kept them going, badly, but going, and I could see them through the window. She planted them the 3rd year we lived here. She said the backyard needed something living that wasn't grass. I thought about her. I thought about Kendall as a kid. I thought about the fact that I was going to have to do something painful because doing nothing would be worse. Ms. Adler referred me to a real estate attorney with experience in fraud cases, a man named Mr. Okafor who worked out of a firm in Pomona. No, not that Okafor either, different one. He was thorough, methodical, and had a way of explaining complex things without condescension, which I appreciated. We documented everything over the following 3 weeks. The construction loan filing was the centerpiece that was a matter of public record and gave us concrete footing. The camera footage of Kendall and Brielle accessing my home office was supplementary. The recorded conversations from the kitchen, again, legal in California with the posted notice, were further corroboration. Mr. Okafor also did something I hadn't thought to do. He contacted the private lender directly. When that lender's legal team understood that the collateral property was not owned by the LLC or by Kendall, that the owner was an uninformed third party, they were extremely motivated to cooperate with us. Lenders don't like fraud either. It exposes them. I still had dinner with Kendall and Brielle during this time. Twice, actually. I brought a bottle of wine to the second one. I sat across from my son and talked about the football season and whether the old deck needed replacing. Brielle was warmer than usual. She thought the signing was imminent, I think, and was examining the approach. I am not a man who cries easily. I cried on the drive home from that second dinner. Not from anger. From something older than anger, the kind of grief that doesn't have a clean name. It's what happens when you see something clearly that you spent a long time hoping you'd been wrong about. There's something I haven't told you yet. Something that matters. During those 3 weeks, while I was working with Mr. Okafor and sitting through dinners and pretending my hearing was worse than it was, I started going through some of Connie's things. I'd been putting it off: her closet, her desk, the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. In the cedar chest, underneath her mother's quilt, I found a journal I didn't know she kept. She'd written in it sporadically over the years, and the last entry was dated about 6 weeks before she died, when she was still well enough to write. She wrote about the house, about wanting me to keep it as long as I wanted it. She wrote about Kendall, how much she loved him, how she saw the same stubbornness in him she'd always seen in me, how she hoped he'd outgrow the part of himself that took shortcuts. And then she wrote something that stopped me completely. If he ever asks Lou for the house, I hope Lou says no, not because of the money, because a man needs one thing that is entirely his after everything. Let him have the roses. I read that 3 times. I kept that journal. It's in the cedar chest now, on top of the quilt. The conversation with Kendall happened on a Saturday morning in early December. I asked him to come alone. No, Brielle. I told him it was about the paperwork, that I'd made a decision. He came. He sat at the same kitchen table. I laid out everything, calmly. The construction loan filing, the dates, the deed form they'd brought, the legal exposure they'd created for themselves, and inadvertently, for that private lender. I told him that Mr. Okafor had already been in contact with the lender's attorneys. I told him where things stood legally. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I'd done both of those things in private already, which is where they belonged. Kendall sat very still for a long time. Then he said, I didn't want it to go this far. I said, how far did you want it to go? He didn't answer that. I told him what was going to happen. He was going to instruct Brielle to retract the loan filing and notify the lender in writing that the property had never been offered as legitimate collateral. He was going to return my house key, and then we were going to take some time, I didn't know how much, and figure out what, if anything, was left of us. I told him I wasn't pressing criminal charges, not because what they'd done didn't warrant it, but because I wasn't going to spend whatever years I had left dragging my son through that process. That was a decision I made for me, not for him. He left after about an hour. He cried on the way out. I stood at the screen door and watched him get in his car, and I felt about 8 things simultaneously, none of which I can fully name even now. Brielle was harder. She called me 2 days later, and the conversation was colder and more businesslike than any conversation I'd had with a family member in my life. She said they would comply. She said she hoped I understood they'd just been trying to find a solution. I told her I understood exactly what they'd been trying to find. I haven't spoken to her since. Here's where I want to tell you what came next, because I know what some of you are thinking. The story ends there, with loss, with a house and a hollow victory and a son who you love and can't quite reach. It doesn't end there. In February, I got a letter from the Claremont Unified School District. I'd applied months earlier, during the worst of all of this, to volunteer with their adult literacy program, something I'd thought about doing since retiring and never gotten around to. They'd accepted me. Would I be available Tuesday and Thursday mornings? I said yes. I went in that first Tuesday not knowing what to expect, and I found myself sitting across from a 61-year-old man named, well, I won't give his name because it's his story, not mine. But he was learning to read at 61, And he came every single Tuesday and Thursday without fail. And he never once complained about how hard it was. He just came and did the work. I don't know what you'd call what that did to me. Recalibration, maybe. Perspective. The reminder that dignity is not something given to you by your children or taken from you by them. It belongs to you. I also, around this time, hired a service to properly restore and expand Connie's rose garden. I'd been keeping the plants alive, but not much more than that. A woman came out, assessed them, told me 2 of the original plants were actually still very healthy under all my benign neglect, and we added 6 new ones. The backyard looks different now. Better, I think. Alive in the way Connie always said a backyard should be. Kendall and I have spoken a handful of times since December. It's not warm. It's not cold either. It's something in the middle that I don't have a name for yet. 2 people trying to figure out if there's something worth salvaging without pretending the damage wasn't real. I don't know how it ends. I don't think you're supposed to know at this stage. What I know is this. The house is mine. The deed is clear. The lock has a new key that I gave to exactly one person, and that person is Ms. Adler for emergencies, and she knows not to use it unless she hears from me first. The roses came up in April, all 8 of them. I stood at the kitchen window. On the first morning I noticed the blooms, that particular orange-pink color Connie always chose, the variety called Mr. Lincoln, which I realize is technically red, but she always said it ran orange in our yard because of the soil, and I held my coffee and I thought, she knew. She knew before I did, and she wrote it down so I'd find it when I needed it. I'm 68 years old. I live alone in a 4-bedroom craftsman in Claremont, California, and I can hear just fine. I just don't always let on.